Tonight's lecture is presented by Dr. Richard Loosbrock, Professor of History and Chair of HAPS. Dr. Loosbrock grew up in Chadron, Nebraska, just outside the Black Hills of South Dakota, and did his undergrad study at the University of Kansas before completing his master's and PhD at the University of New Mexico. He's been at Adams State since 2000. He's had distinct pleasure of having many great students over the years, including interim President David Tenberg and myself. He currently oversees the MA in U.S. History program and supervises a number of graduate students working on their theses. By training, he's a specialist in the American West, but now researches in the areas of U.S. sports history. In the early 2000s, he did a major project for the History Channel, writing This Day in Civil War History, that ran on their website for nearly 20 years. He's also worked extensively as a tour guide, teaching hundreds of teachers in various places around the country, but specializing in Boston and Washington, D.C. He also works with the NCAA. He has been with the NCAA faculty. He's been the NCAA faculty athletics representative since 2006 for Adams State, and from 2013 to 2017 represented the Rocky Mountain Athletic Conference, RMAC, on the Division II Management Council. He now serves as the vice chair of the NCAA Division II Committee on Infractions. So help me in welcoming Dr. Loosbrock.
Here, so that's really good. I also feel self-conscious, Nick, because this is like your area. This is European history that we're dealing with here to some extent. But what I'm going to do tonight is really kind of talk about what happened. This summer I was able to go to a conference over in Sarajevo. And it was part of a long project that I've been working on kind of World War I and the development of American sports. I've been kind of chipping away at this slowly over time. And the conference that I went to was really a fascinating conference. It was a conference called Why Remember? And it was really about how things are memorialized and remembered, obviously, mostly in terms of trauma, in terms of wars and genocides and things like that. I happen to be doing it about how Americans have remembered World War I. And the paper, the project I was doing, the presentation I gave, was actually about how Americans have kind of, right after World War I, Americans started putting up all these little monuments all around the country like they typically do, particularly on like courthouses and in public parks. And it didn't last that long. And all of a sudden, Americans kind of stopped remembering World War I. They kind of turned over the writing of World War I to really their British scholars and things like that. And by the way, the British don't usually write very well about Americans during World War I because they think they sort of showed up late and didn't perform particularly well. And I think Americans just kind of lost sight of World War I. Plus, World War I was at the end of World War I in 1918, you had a year of incredible trauma in the United States. The flu that killed 675,000 Americans, and then lots of strikes and race riots. 1919 was one of the worst years in American history. And I think that kind of soured Americans on the experience of World War I. But what they did do was they started building sports stadiums. And all the memorial stadiums you see around the country, Los Angeles Coliseum, Memorial Coliseum, I graduated in one at University of Kansas and University of Nebraska and Illinois and California and Texas and Clemson. They're all memorial stadiums built to do that. So that was what I was doing there. But the conference I found was like I said, a fascinating group. It was also a fascinating time. I was there on July 8th and 9th. I happened to be there. It was interesting. The guy who was introducing me to give my presentation was himself from Britain. And literally, he started to talk about my thing, and right then, his phone lights up, and it was Boris Johnson announcing his resignation. And the guy started almost shouting. He was so excited. As well as everybody else in the room started cheering and everything like that, because Boris Johnson, not a terribly popular figure, particularly among people like academics. So that was it. But the second day of the conference was really fascinating, because we went out to a place called Srebrenica. So let's just talk about this briefly here, and I'll kind of abbreviate some of this here and go through it a little bit faster. Let's see, Jess, how do I get back over to that other? There we go. We're talking about the Balkan region of southeastern Europe. And, the Balkan region is known to have this kind of long and tragic history. It's a diverse area, lots of different races or ethnicities and religions rubbing up against one another. To the point where, like I said, we use the term Balkanization to basically mean anything that is sort of disunified and fragmented and usually contentious, right? It's usually, do we ever use use the term Balkanization in a positive way. I don't think we ever do. And that's kind of what it is. That's the area of the world that we're dealing with down here. A little bit of background talking about here, north of Greece, was obviously part of the Byzantine Empire after the fall of Rome. The Byzantine Empire is, it's always news to my students that the Roman Empire actually went on well beyond, 476 CE in the eastern half, and took on a different look. Of course, the Christian religion takes on a different look over there with Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Later, it will become part of the Ottoman Empire. The Muslim Ottoman Empire will move in and take over that area, and it's going to put a significant stamp on it. I'll say something about the Ottomans, actually, because one of the things that was interesting to me was several times I went to places, and you'd see the Turkish flag on things, particularly on the memorial out at Srebrenica. And that's a little odd because Turkey itself is considered kind of a bad player down there in some ways nowadays. And in fact, that the question came up, why the building that we were in, the Turks had actually put up the money to do the building. And some people at this conference, we got to talk to the guy who was the head of this. His name was Amir. And somebody asked Amir, one of the other scholars said, how can you take Turkish money? Turkish money is blood money. How can you do that here? And he said, most of my Western donors don't want to put money into infrastructure. They only want to fund exhibits. And he said, but the Turks have a real interest in this, partly because they like to restore things that were from the Ottoman Empire. And they also want to, kind of exert their own influence in a positive way kind of in that area there. Later, of course, then, if you look at Europe here you can kind of see the green sections down there represent the Ottoman Empire, so you see that they're firmly entrenched. Later, then, we get the rise of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Really by the 19th century, the Austro-Hungarians now control that area there. And I think that's also adds to the complexity of what you see in the Balkan region, is the fact that you've had these very different kinds of empires and influences over time that's kind of been passed around upon. The Austro-Hungarian section here, I want to spend just a little bit of time on. When we get to the 19th century, and again, Nick, you should just get up and do this one. Obviously, when I teach my classes, I emphasize the role of nationalism. The nationalism is kind of the major political force of the 19th century, as opposed to previous sort of ethnic and religious and racial classifications. Now we have these national boundaries, and that becomes people's major identity. And that obviously is going to overlay these ethnic and racial and religious pasts that we have here on this. The kind of the problem here when it comes to Srebrenica is going to be the Serbians, and the Serbians do have a kind of distinctive role down there. In the 19th century, they're the one area that manages to kind of break free from both the Ottomans and the Austro-Hungarians and have their own little independent nation down there as well. So Serbian national movements then are going to also spark similar ambitions among the other neighbors in that area, the Croats, Bosnians, Montenegrins. We can do a whole series of them that we could look at down in that area. On the way over there, I intentionally chose, when I flew to, I had a chance to have a 13-hour layover in Vienna. And every time I told somebody this, I'm like, wow, that really stinks. I was like, no, this was actually planned on my part because I wanted to go see Vienna. I had never been to Vienna before. And so I was able to take a train in there, and I tromped miles and miles walking around Vienna. And then I realized something, that I had almost not slept on the plane on the way over. I got totally gassed out by my day in Vienna there. And but I went by this. This is the Hofburg Palace. This was one of the major palaces of the Habsburg Empire. And so they have a role to play down there. They're the ones that obviously dominate that area in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So I was going by the Hofburg Palace. I also took a picture of this. This is actually kind of eerie to me. This is what they call the Hitler balcony. After the takeover of the annexation of Austria by the Germans, Hitler came to Vienna and addressed the crowd from that particular balcony there. So I found that rather creepy. This is, of course, Sarajevo itself, and this is where World War I begins. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the successor to the Austro-Hungarian throne. He makes a rather ill-advised trip down to Sarajevo amidst growing tensions down there with the Serbians, and there is a hit squad of Serbians that is sent out to assassinate him. It doesn't go correctly. There's a bomb thrown. It misses. The motorcade works its way on through Sarajevo. The Archduke goes and makes a visit to a hospital. And then on their way back, the motorcade actually takes a wrong turn at one point, and it ends up turning down this street right here. And all of a sudden it comes to a stop and realizes they've made a mistake, and they start to back up, except one of the assassins who was in the, I don't know if you'd say the right place at the wrong time or the wrong place at the right time, but happens to be Gabriel Princip and happens to be standing there thinking he's failed on his mission, and then his target shows up right in front of him. And he assassinates both the Archduke and his wife. And this is an incident that, strangely enough, it doesn't seem to have a huge impact back in Austria itself. They have accounts of people continuing to drink coffee around Vienna that night, and it's kind of interesting news, but not a particularly big deal. But it starts this chain of events that pretty much puts all of Europe at war due to complicated set of alliances, in particular there. Germany, issues what's called the blank check for Austria to go down and smash the Serbs, and this triggers the entrance of Russia into the war. Russia, the Slavs there are really like little cousins to the Russians, and they have interest in that area clearly. So it triggers a war between Austria and Russia, which also then brings in Germany and also brings in France. It's really kind of crazy to explain this stuff. You're in the other class. You're in my women's history class. I was explaining this in my U.S. Navy World Wars class, that Europe goes from this, fairly extended period of prosperity, and then in the matter of 6 weeks, the entire continent is at war, and it's really kind of a hard thing to kind of figure out there. Well, I had to take some pictures of myself there, and I also had to go down the street because right over here, just down past this area, there's a nice little bar there, so I had to go have a beer to toast the memory, I guess you could say, of the Archduke. And but it moves on from here. Yugoslavia is the entity that's created out of the Versailles Agreement. The Versailles Treaty, of course, is the first major redrawing of the map of Europe since the Congress of Vienna a century before. And I think the main gist of this is you get three big entities out of it. In this complex stew of nationalism and ethnicity and religious differences, you have in Eastern Europe three new creations: the country of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. And of course, of those, Yugoslavia is by far the most complex in all of this. And Yugoslavia is essentially born out of there. The major figure in Yugoslavia's history is going to be Josip Broz Tito, Marshal Tito. He will, start to become a major political player around the time of World War II. World War II would be a whole other can of worms to go into, but that is the scene of all kinds of atrocities and violence as the Nazis moved down into that area. Yugoslavia emerges out of there, and Tito is considered a communist, right? He's considered a Marxian in this sense. And therefore, a natural alignment with the Soviet Union, except there's a lot of things that break that alliance up. It's clear that Tito is a different kind of communist in a sense than Stalin. I think one issue is he kind of advocated a little friendlier stance towards the West and taking a Marshall Plan money in some of these. And so they'll be kind of kicked out of the little Soviet realm there. If you look at most maps of the Cold War, Yugoslavia is always a different color. There's always the blue in the west and red in the east. You can see the clear difference. And Yugoslavia is always striped or gray or white or something different that way. So it did have a different alignment. A lot of things you can say about Tito over time, except for I guess the main thing here, though, that I would emphasize is he was brutal in a lot of ways and thuggish. And yet at the same time, in the long, sad history of Yugoslavia, he's probably the one that really could kind of hold it together. Let me digress for a quick second about this. This came up in my own research a long time ago when I was doing my master's thesis. And it was interesting. I was doing a longitudinal population study, meaning studying the census, down in Elizabethtown, New Mexico. And I had this weird blip. I was counting ethnicities. I was mostly looking at the kind of the Hispanic population down there and how that fit in. And I was doing this starting in the 1870 census, and I would tabulate, here's somebody that's clearly Hispanic, and here's somebody that's native-born American, here's somebody from Ireland. All of a sudden, I had a problem in 1920 with my census study because a bunch of people from southeastern Europe showed up. Montenegrins and Serbians showed up in the Moreno Valley of northern New Mexico. And I had to go to our Bosnian, we had a Balkan historian down at UNM, and I went and talked to her about it. She gave me a pile of books. And what happened was I found out that really from about 1908 to 1912, there was a significant unrest down there and ethnic conflict, and that triggered, as it usually does, a round of refugees. And some of these refugees ended up in the Moreno Valley, New Mexico. And there was only really about 3 families, but it was enough to, these were small populations I was doing here, and so it was enough to cause a blip that I had to then explain, basically. So I realized then that there was already trouble back at that time. Yugoslavia will, it'll exist from really 1919 effectively at the Versailles Treaty all the way up until the 1990s. The death of Marshal Tito comes in 1980, and it was a big deal at the time because he was such a, kind of a long-standing leader over there, important figure during the Cold War. I remember when he finally died, and the reporting on it was pretty significant. But I don't think anybody thought about what would happen after that time. And of course, what happens after that time is Yugoslavia starts to come unraveled. It takes a few years. Initially, things just go fine there. And in fact, I wanted to mention this real quick. This is actually something that every Bosnian I met this summer told me about. The Olympics. They're very proud of the 1984 Winter Olympics. I met, I was talking to people on the streets. I met several through, various contacts there. They all wanted to talk about the Olympics. The 1984 games, the Winter Games in Sarajevo, are considered, that's another circle of research people that I hang out with, or people that do research on the Olympics. I presented in Rio right before the Olympics back in 2016. And they can tell you that those 84 games were considered to be particularly good games. They were well organized. They came off without a hitch. There's always things that pop up, particularly traffic problems in places like Atlanta or Lake Placid, New York, for example. These games seem to go off without a hitch. They also seem to be a good set of games that came amidst a fair amount of turmoil. The 1976 games that were held in Montreal were characterized by a boycott of several African countries over recent participation. They weren't there at that game of South Africa. The 1980 games, of course, get really rocked when the United States boycotts the Summer Games in Moscow because of the invasion of Afghanistan 7 or 8 months before. There was a pall already kind of hanging over the 84 Summer Games that were going to be in Los Angeles over what the Soviets might do. And, of course, the Soviets wait late in that cycle, and then they boycott the 1984 games. So Sarajevo in February of 1984 looks pretty good. And I mentioned here, this is a couple of things. That's the opening ceremonies that were grand and all. This is Torval and Dean. I don't know if you guys ever know that sports story. It's a pretty amazing story. Jane Torval and Christopher Dean were ice dancers from Britain, and they pulled off something that's never been done before or since. They perfect scored the final dance thing, and it is stunning. If you ever want to see a great sporting event, go Google this and take a look at it. It's a perfect performance. They do it to Bolero. I mean, it really brought down the house. By the way, this is in the Zetra Ice Arena, and it's the same place at the same Olympics. Scott Hamilton from the United States won a gold medal over there as well. So it had all this kind of feel-good stuff about these things. And it was really, and I do remember, I've always followed the Olympics pretty carefully. I think I was like about 18 at the time. And I remember watching those games, and that they always have the backstory on things, right, to the Olympics. The backstory of this one was, this is a troubled land, and now look at it. It's great. Everything is perfect here. That was really the narrative. This is then what happens a few years later. That's Zetra Ice Arena, where Torval and Dean performed. This is in 1992 after a shell hit it and caught it on fire. By the way, that arena is still there. I caught a glimpse of it when I was going by at one point this year. I didn't get to stop and take a picture of it. But then I took this other picture. This is something you see all over Bosnia. Graveyards in places where graveyards shouldn't be. And there's a graveyard now right across from the Zetra Ice Arena because a lot of times Sarajevo was under siege for 3 years. People were dying. They were getting killed by Serbian snipers all over the place. They couldn't get them to a graveyard to bury them, so they just had to create these makeshift graveyards everywhere. And they put one right across from Zetra Ice Arena that's still there. They have redone Zetra Ice Arena, and they've renamed it the Juan Antonio Samaranch, like Sports Hall or something. And it has gone back to hosting international, skating events and things of that sort. There is a quick map of old Yugoslavia, and you can sort of see these are all now independent countries. This is the process of breaking up. It starts fracturing in the late 1980s. And then it really starts to kind of blow up in the early 1990s. Another sort of sports-related thing, one of those 30 for 30s that ESPN did that I think is excellent for explaining this stuff is they did a 30 for 30 about 10 years ago called Once Brothers. It was about Vlade Divac and Drazen Petrovic, who were two really good basketball players. Yugoslavia had an outstanding basketball team that won the European Championship in 1990, and they took the silver medal in 1988, and the year the Americans took the bronze medal, actually. And it's about these two that had this great friendship. They were part of Yugoslavia's great basketball teams. They get to the NBA in the early 90s, and Drazen Petrovic was Croat, and Vlade Divac was Serbian. And they basically, their friendship gets fractured because their country is fractured back home. So it's one of those, I think it's a cool documentary because you kind of learn about sports basketball, but you really learn about the history of those areas and what happens over there. I'll skip past some of this. This is actually a slide that I can't take credit for. I actually snapped it off something else that I saw, but it kind of explains, the deep roots of conflict there, and then, how it flowers into the conflict there of the 1990s. So I won't go through that blow by blow, but I thought that actually kind of, helps explain them. It helps explain a lot of the words, actually. You can apply this to many different situations over time. But this is a better map. This shows Bosnia itself. And what it shows you here by the different colors is it shows you, kind of where the Serbs live, where the Muslims live, and where Croats live. Croatia, by the way, is right over here. Serbia is right over here. But you kind of get the sense from this, and of course this is not exact at all. You get a sense of the intertwinedness of these different groups. And again, this is, Nick and I, we both teach about imperialism and all that, and I'm always amazed to me at how imperialism leads to these kind of long-buried seeds of resentment. We see this in Africa very prominently. The Rwanda genocide in 1994 was really the product of British policy from a generation before, but it festered. The British had a way of ruling where they would pit groups against one another and favor some groups, and that would kind of allow a small minority of Brits to rule over an area. But the result was essentially sowing the seeds of hatred that would, again, kind of germinate over time. And that's kind of what we have here as well. So you see how closely intertwined they all are. And by the way, I'll come back to another map here in a second. This is, after Tito's death, we start to see things changing in Yugoslavia. The rise of Slobodan Milosevic, and Milosevic is clearly a bad guy in all of this. It's I just got done reading another book by a guy, a British journalist named Tim Foster, that wrote Tim Marshall wrote a book. Tim Foster used to be here in Colorado, and he wrote a personal account of being in Bosnia back at that time. And he says Milosevic is just a thug. Basically, he's a mafia boss that got to be head of a country for a long time, and he acted that way. He stole from the public. He pitted, again, used violence and threats of violence and all this. Clearly one of the bad guys there, and he's the guy in the middle right here. And then another key player here is Radovan Karadzic, right over here. He also will be kind of one of the bad guys in this as well. The situation what I'm kind of focused on here is going to be over in the eastern part of Bosnia, right on the Serbian border, where a lot of Serbians were living, but they typically were living among larger populations of Muslims in that area, and that's kind of going to be the problem in a lot of this. When that war kicks in and Bosnia starts to fall, Bosnia starts to find itself under all kinds of attacks. Serbians kind of attacking, or at least providing weapons to Serbians in the eastern part of Bosnia, Croats attacking and providing support for Croats in the west and southern parts of Bosnia. And it turns into the Bosnian War that goes really from 1992 to 1995. And you can see 100,000 deaths during this war, but probably about half the country becomes refugees at some point during that war. And that's a real tragedy here. This is a few pictures that I wanted to kind of share with you. The picture on the right, by the way, is one I took when I was there. That's right outside of my hotel on this big grand avenue in Sarajevo there. And you can see the picture on the left, that same building, obviously on fire back in the early 1990s. It shows you the intensity of the conflict. The UN sent in some sort of peacekeepers. And in some ways, I would argue, And it's funny because I think as academics, we always root for the UN. We always think the UN are the good guys that are trying to come in and play these roles. I think many times they are, but in this case, I think they made it a lot worse. And typically what the UN and other world leaders, including Bill Clinton at the time, and George H.W. Bush at the time, and Madeleine Albright, who plays a big role, which, by the way, one thing I did see a lot when I was over there was books and pictures of Bill Clinton and Madeleine Albright. They're kind of considered somewhat heroes, because they helped to negotiate the end of this in 1995. But at the time, just reading that recent book by Tim Marshall, that it was he actually blamed Madeleine Albright for being very naive about these safe zones that were set up supposedly over in different parts of Bosnia. This is also a picture I took that when I was on that boulevard there. Right on that boulevard, in fact, you can almost see it in the pictures I took, was this monument to a kid named, a 7-year-old boy named Nerman Divovic. And it is a hard story, and if you Google this on the internet, you'll see the picture of it. He and his mother were crossing a street there. There was supposedly a temporary ceasefire going on. Sarajevo, as I said, was under siege for years. It was a difficult supply line. The UN was in control of the airport out on the south side of Sarajevo. They had tunnels coming in to literally help them get supplies in and distribute them around. And I have another story about that I'll share with you later. He was crossing the street with his mother, and a sniper shot his mother. The bullet went right through his mother and hit the boy in the head and killed him instantly. And there's horrifying pictures of this. And it was one of those moments that really kind of brought the horror of the war home and all. They now have this monument to him there. I'm not sure it's a happy story, but his father, Nerman's father, was actually off fighting with with forces during the war. And after the war, the couple got pregnant again, had another boy, and named Nerman in honor of the other. So there is still a boy by that name, or at least a man by that name now running around, but it's a tragedy there of all kinds of proportions. I put these pictures in to show you what Sarajevo looks like. Sarajevo was beautiful. And I was really amazed. I said I went to really 3 distinctive parts of Bosnia. I went to the middle part of Sarajevo, went to the east, and then I went to the south. To me, Sarajevo looks a lot like San Francisco. That's what it reminds me of. Just the hills with kind of the houses rolling up outside. The climate kind of felt like that. Of course, I was there in the summer. It was pretty nice. We went to a restaurant up on top. I was telling this story. I might have been telling you, Mark, this story, I believe, but I said, we got in these cabs, because we were at this museum event. We got in these cabs and we started screaming up these hills. Everybody's got stick shifts there because you need it on those hills. They're really steep. And we were just blowing up these hills. And I'm in the front seat of the cab. So of course, they're either like, oh, you're tall, you sit in the front seat. And so I got to see the horrors up front. And literally, we're blowing up these things, and we're in these tiny little streets. And I see another car coming, and I'm like, we're clearly going to have a head-on here. Somehow we swerved around, and I joked. I said I expected to see, Jason Bourne jumping rooftop to rooftop over me. It was that kind of narrow sort of confine. By the way, later it was like a 4-mile drive up there. We got to the top and we had this beautiful dinner and a great conversation, all this kind of stuff. And at the end, the guy that was running the conference, the guy from England, said, "Well, we really can't get cabs up here, so we should just walk back." And I'm like, where I am, our hotel was way down past there. Turned out to be a fascinating walk, though. But at one point, I'm going down these narrow streets, and 2 cars are coming each way. I literally had to plaster myself up against the wall, and I could feel the wind of the car as it went by me. It was really fun, but it was fascinating to do. So I just took that picture. It was also fascinating because I don't know that I've ever been in a Muslim-majority country, which is what Bosnia is. And I actually could hear, when you're up there, you can hear the call to prayer at night. In the morning, I had my hotel window open. I heard the call to prayer at like 4 or 5 in the morning, and I heard the call to prayer at like after 10 o'clock at night. I had a long day for that. Let me show you this video real quick. If I can get this
And the worst mass killing on European soil since World War II, and part of what the UN says was a campaign of genocide. But 20 years on, what do we know about what happened? July 1995, tens of thousands of Bosnian Muslims had fled a Bosnian Serb army offensive and were under siege in Srebrenica, today's eastern Bosnia. The area was meant to be a UN safe zone and was protected by about 600 lightly armed Dutch peacekeepers. But on the 6th of July, the Bosnian Serb army began advancing, taking some peacekeepers hostage, and within days they'd entered Srebrenica itself. The Bosnian Serb army demanded that the Bosnian Muslim fighters hand over all their weapons in exchange for safety. They then took aside men aged between 12 and 77 for what they said would be interrogation. The first killings began just 2 days later. In all, over 8,000 Bosnian Muslims were killed in just 5 days. And over 23,000 women and children were forcibly deported, with reports of widespread torture and rape. Even now, 20 years on, victims are still being identified and reburied. While Serbia has apologized for what it said was a crime, it denies that the killings were a systematic attempt to eradicate a people. In other words, a genocide.
That is tough to watch, obviously. The second day of our conference, this is when we went out to this place, and we drove out. It was like a 2-hour drive, like 2.5-hour drive from Sarajevo, which was really great because I got to see a lot of neat country. If I said that, I said Sarajevo looked like San Francisco to me, Eastern Bosnia looks a lot like the Appalachians. I've done a lot around Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. It looked just like that around there, very steep hills, very lush countryside. And this was this old battery factory. By the way, right up here, you can see that's the Turkish saying that the Turks funded this place. It was an old battery factory where they used to make these batteries back in the Cold War era. They sold a lot to apparently the Soviet Navy to power their subs and all. It's got that bleak communist architecture look to it. Really, I think is the best way to describe it. And we went in. Well, then it was fascinating because we listened to this man. This man was a fairly young boy. I think he said he was about 9 at the time. And he was part of all of this, and his father was one of those that was murdered. He and his mother had to walk for about 30 miles through the woods over several days to kind of get to safety from this, and he had incredibly stirring stories about that. They also have an exhibit in this museum that shows shoes, and these are shoes that the people fleeing from this actual war and have now been read back. It reminded me a lot, if you've been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., there's that pile of shoes that, is kind of a real gotcha moment that really is very traumatic to actually see at the Holocaust Museum, and that's what this kind of was there as well. And then right across the street, this is actually in a place called Hotochok. I'll have it on here coming up. Can't remember the name of the little town. It's actually just right next to Srebrenica. They have this this monument right here, and you can see the 8372. That's the number they attribute that were killed over that 5-day period. Most of them were killed in the first couple of days. The sad thing was, you saw the video footage of all those people there. Almost every man you saw there was probably killed within 72 hours of that video footage being taken. This is now the memorial. They have a long wall with every name on there who was killed. They have a kind of a canopy here. That's actually Muslim men doing the midday prayer while we were there. And I was there on July 9th. July 11th is recognized as the Memorial Day for that. That's actually the day that really the events started. Most of the men were killed on the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th of July. But they recognized the 11th. The 11th was the day, and one group that does not come off well in this whole story are the Dutch. The Dutch were actually there. Their soldiers were the peacekeepers that were stationed at at that battery factory. And all these Muslims had come into these gates of this battery factory. And the Dutch actually asked they asked the major UN commanders there what they should do. And the UN commanders really tell them, well, you really can't keep them around, so you got to kick them out. So the Dutch have to push these men back out into the arms of the waiting Serbs. And that's exactly what happened to the Bosnian Serbs. And so then what you have is, this is one, these are pictures again that I took. This is an open grave, that's an open grave. So when this happened in 1995, they buried the bodies. Most of them were buried in areas right around Srebrenica, and they put them in mass graves. Well then, less than 6 months later, the war ended. The Dayton Agreement, signed in Dayton, Ohio, and really that was one that Madeleine Albright and Bill Clinton get some credit for, brought the hostilities to an end. And all of a sudden, all these Bosnian Serbs in that area realized that they had to cover up the evidence of mass murder. So they started to disinter these bodies and move them everywhere. I think I saw that they have located 370 sites where these bodies were eventually placed. They also have accounts. The guy that, Amir, that runs this place, said that they've actually found some bodies in 3 different locations. And it's just horrendous. And so what they started, about 1999, they started a project to start to gather these bodies back. And they began to collect them in the cemetery. Out of the 8,300 that were killed, there's now about 6,500 graves in that cemetery. Every year, they uncover more, and they go through the process of DNA identification, and they bring them back. There was 50 graves about 50 graves getting ready to be filled a few days later. And in fact, while we were there, the truck rolled up with all the bodies on it, or all the caskets, the remains. It had flowers decked out on this kind of a big semi-truck. And it was getting ready for 2 days later when they were going to have thousands of people coming to do the preparation. But after those graves, they were open and ready to go and ready to receive the next victims. And this has been happening every year for 20 years now, more than 20, pushing 25 years they've been doing this. And these are just some pictures of the cemetery, as you can see. This was the 2016 commemoration, and you can see they show up in these very kind of narrow caskets. And they go ahead and bury them. The numbers have been, obviously, the numbers of caskets have been going down each year because they've obviously been running out of, they've been not finding as many victims. So this was a bigger batch probably than what you would have had in, say, 2022. And this was taken just a few weeks ago. I took this out of one of the press clippings from there. This is also something I wanted to mention because while I was in Sarajevo, there was a museum right across, and part of our conference, one night the night we went up on top of the mountain to have dinner, we went to this museum, and they were doing an artistic tribute to the Srebrenica victims. These are teacups, and what they were doing was they were painting teacups. They've been having volunteers come in and paint teacups, each one uniquely to honor a different victim from the genocide there. And I would just have you look at what that looks like visually. There's one stretch, and then I kind of took a picture of these. Are just, you can see the racks all the way around loaded with teacups, and every one of them represents one of these victims. It was a truly stunning thing to watch, very, very sobering to see that. The Dayton Accords come and eventually create an uneasy peace, but it ends up kind of sticking. There's still going to be problems in eastern Bosnia for some time to come. I mentioned that I'm the vice chair of the Division II Committee on Infractions for the NCAA. But it turns out the chair, he and I had to go to Indianapolis right after this for a hearing. He and I got talking. He's a lawyer from Tulsa, but he said, "Oh, you were in Bosnia, right?" And he said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Were you Srebrenica?" He said, "Yeah." Turns out he was stationed there. He was stationed there in 1999. He said he spent the millennium there, the 1999 to 2000 thing. He was in an infantry unit, and they were stationed in Srebrenica. And he said basically our job was to keep them separated, to kind of protect the Muslims in that area. He told stories about playing soccer with these kids all the time. I said, an American GI playing soccer against a European kid, how did that go? He goes, not well. We got crushed every time. But that was what they did, and that was what he was doing in that area there. I want to show you a few more pictures from other parts of Bosnia to show you how this war also impacted things. This is actually pronounced Konec, is the name of the town. I spent an extra day and I went down to southern Bosnia. This is a town that's not too far south of Sarajevo. Like most towns in Bosnia, it was under attack during this conflict. And this is another one, got put under siege for a while there. And I wanted to show you a couple pictures here. I took a picture of this bridge, one of those Ottoman-built bridges, from that era. And then I walked up on this hillside, and I looked down over the bridge right here. And then I turned around, and I took this picture. That's the cemetery, mostly Muslim cemetery there in Konec. Then I walked back down to the bridge, but I want to show you something here really quick. So this is another town that, like I said, it got under sniper fire. I walked down and went through this part of the town, and you can see right back in here, those are graves. That was a city park. That was another one of those where bodies were piling up. They had to put them in the ground, so a city park became another cemetery because they couldn't do anything else other than that. And then I want to show you one more picture that I think is very interesting here. This is looking past the bridge there. And of course, what you see here is you see the steeple, the classic kind of onion dome of an Eastern Orthodox church, and you see a mosque. But the mosques, the top of the minaret is broken off. It was broken off during that conflict, and they never fixed it. But I also find that fascinating because this is what the Balkans have been. It's all these groups that live very carefully and closely with one another. And you see that represented there by their two churches that are just literally yards apart from one another. I went down to southern Bosnia. This is actually a dervish monastery and an incredible place. I've never seen anything like this before. This river flows out of a huge spring underground. This is a whole river coming straight out of the mountain there. And just a beautiful thing to see. And it flows about 10 miles, and then it dumps into another river right here. And it's kind of this, it's sort of like Mark to go and use some earth science here, it's like a hard shelf of resilient rock, and this river comes and kind of fans out over it, and then it all spills in along this long, several hundred yards you've got of the river spilling in. It's just really pretty. But I went on down to, this is another town called Positio. It's like a little medieval village. And the reason I took this picture is because we came in on this road, we parked down here, and we hiked up to this old tower there. But I want to show you right there, you see that? That is a banner. And it's a banner that is honoring Srebrenica. It's in southern Bosnia. This is 3 or 4 hours away drive from Srebrenica. But they were still honoring it there. And I'm going to mention one last little bit yet before I get done about this and why I think that's kind of important. Then I went to this town. This is the town of Mostar. And Mostar is a really pretty place there. Kind of hot. I said when I got down to southern Bosnia, it reminded me of Southern California. It's kind of dry and hot like that, vineyards everywhere. But Mostar, this bridge itself is all story. First of all, you can look and you can see 2 mosques right behind there, and then there's another 2 mosques on the other side of the river to my left. But that bridge was built by the Ottomans in the late 1500s. I think it was completed about 1560. And that bridge stood for centuries until 1993. And I'm literally on a rock taking this picture in the middle of this river. And to the back of me, another 100 yards down or 200 yards down, is another bridge, a steel bridge, a modern bridge. And this is attacked by the Croats. And the Croats came in, and they put a tank out on that, and they shot that bridge until it collapsed. A almost 500-year-old bridge. It has since been rebuilt with, not surprisingly, Turkish money. Again, the Turks trying to make sure that they restore anything that's sort of Ottoman around that area there. And it's really, you go up, these young men go up and they pass a hat, and when they get enough money in the hat, they jump off the bridge. And it's a big old fall. They jump down into the water and swim over and wait until they pass the hat and do it again. But very interesting. The other thing about this town too, in Mostar, is up past that other mosque that you see, not too far up here, there's kind of a downtown area. And there's 2 things that struck me there. One, right in the middle of this downtown, this is very touristy, it was very crowded. And, there's a building right in the middle of downtown that's just a shell of a building. It looks like something after World War II. It's never been rebuilt. Sarajevo has it. Sarajevo is modern and bustling, but yet every once in a while there is a building just completely shelled out that has never been touched again. The other thing is there's another one of those city parks up there where sniper fire killed enough people they had to make it into a cemetery because they couldn't get to their other cemetery. And of course, if you know anything about Islam, they need to be buried, right away, right that day when they die. So there's another one of those there. And then I wanted to show you this person real quick. This is Amina, and she was my tour guide that I did down there. And Amina and I had a lot in common because I've done a lot of tour guiding, so she and I were comparing notes about how you manage people and all. And I was on this, it was a small tour. I was on with a young woman from Montreal who was French-Canadian, who was a law student. And then there was a Muslim couple from Dubai. And they asked, I said, well, I'm from the United States. I was sitting in the front seat, of course. They put the big guy up front, while they sat in the back seat of this little van. And the couple from Dubai, the husband said, where in the United States? I said, Colorado. Turns out he's a PhD in electrical engineering. He had done his undergrad at UCD in Denver, and he did his master's and PhD in Boulder. So he knew Denver really well, so we were talking a lot about that. But the reason I mentioned Amina in here, Amina is, she told me these fascinating stories. She herself is Muslim, although I'm not sure she didn't say if she's a practicing Muslim, but that's her, her ethnic background. And she is about 40 years old, so at the time she would have been, I think she said she was born about 1982. So she would have been about 10 years old when the Bosnian War hit, when Sarajevo was put under siege. And she said that her childhood was spent gathering food on a daily basis for her family. And she even showed us in Sarajevo, she showed us there was a UN compound there, and there were these big gates, and she said, that's where I learned to speak English, was I'd have to go to those gates and beg for food every day from the UN soldiers that were there. And this was her existence for, from about age 10 to, 13, 14 years old. Pretty incredible. The reason I'm mentioning her, though, is we got in and we started talking about this stuff. Of course, I also told her I was a historian, so she got a little bit edgy with me right at first, because I just told her I'd been to Srebrenica, and immediately she got kind of almost, I wouldn't say defensive, it was almost attack mode. She goes, well, what did you think about Srebrenica? I said, well, it's stunning what people did out there. She started to defend the Bosnian Serbs. Now, she's Muslim. You'd think for her, those would be the bad guys, because not only were they not Muslim, they were killing Muslims out there. But she defended them vociferously. And she's like, you know what they were facing. They were a minority out there. Those people were scared. That's what really caused them to do this. And I just kind of let her rip for a little bit. And but I found it fascinating, because what I kind of determined over the course of the day, and we keep talking about this over the course of the day, was for her, she's Bosnian, bottom line. So for her, this was an ugly time, but now they're over it. And now they all get along. They always got along fine. They had a bad period. Now they get along fine again. And so it was very important for her to project that. And it was a little ironic then, because we got down to Post-Antil, and after she was really kind of complaining over the fact that the next day was going to be the Memorial Day out at Srebrenica, and she didn't like all the attention that it brought, all the negative attention that it was bringing to Bosnia. So that's why she was a little bit upset about that. So we get down to Post-Antil, and there's a banner up there about Srebrenica up on that tower. And I did not ask her about that actually, but I kind of wanted to just sit there and say, well, right there, this is kind of a big deal. But it was fascinating to talk to her throughout the course of the day and get her kind of opinions on all of this. But for her, like I said, for her, Bosnia is a great place where everybody gets along fine. And it was just that period of the 1990s that wasn't so good. So it's, I think, her way of kind of building this memory in on all of this. Well, let me slow down there. And thank you for listening to all this. Appreciate all that. Any questions or comments? Yes.
So you're talking about that there are some buildings that are still shelled out.
Yeah.
And not restored. And is that on purpose, or?
I think it's
like to remember, because that's very common in India.
That is common.
Still.
That is common to have that over there. I don't know, because I don't know the story of the buildings that I saw.
That's the thing with a lot of things like churches, they just leave them.
Right. Like, what's the one at where was the big
Coventry.
Yeah, Coventry. Of course, they made that into a memorial, actually. But the
It's
one
not
building.
only one. There are other churches. Always one in Liverpool. They're quite common.
Yeah, the one that I saw, particularly in Sarajevo, on that big avenue that I walked up and down several times between the Latin Bridge and my hotel there, that looked to be kind of an intentional thing. It looked like an old historic building, and it had literally grass growing out of it now, and I think that looked like it was intentional because it was right in the middle of a modernized, highly developed area. Mm-hmm. I don't know the one in Mostar, so I'm not sure about that. Yeah, Nick?
I'm curious, so the last 3 year time, in Spain, the theory was for a long time that there was this collective amnesia, that there was kind of a willful forgetting of the dictatorship. Everybody just kind of wanted to put the difference behind them, and they were going to sort of just move on. Everybody got along, and it was fine, right? And then you have the next generation that suddenly wanted to talk about it, and so in the past 10 years or so, there's been a lot of exhumations. There's been a lot of reburials, a lot of calling attention to interrogating sort of the post-Franco settlement, which is, in a sense, kind of a handshake between the key party leaders, the sort of reformed Francoists, and the leftists who had been persecuted during the Civil War. And it seems like that has broken down, and there's now like a desire to talk about this. So I don't know if it's comments or a question, but it's I'm curious. Maybe the children of this generation are going to be more curious about, hey, Mom, you learning English, asking for food at the UN distribution center. We got to talk about that. That's a big deal. Yeah. And I just kind of wonder where this all might lead. It sounds like she's kind of repressing some really powerful feelings.
I think she was. She did tell us starkly about it, but then other times, like I said, it was sort of this. Well, we had a bad few years, kind of a deal. And but it was interesting because I met all the people I met over there. I jumped into a cab. First night I got there, my plane got in really late, and there was 3 planes in Sarajevo's airport. Sarajevo's International Airport has 5 gates, which is fascinating to me. It's not a bad airport, but so of course some of the planes they just let out. You have to trounce across the tarmac to get in. But 3 planes were coming in at the same time. I was like, oh, this could be a problem to get a cab into town. Fortunately, a cab let me in, and they said, oh, thank her. It was a woman from Sarajevo, and there was a guy in the back seat also from Sarajevo, and they had an empty seat, so they're like, let's take that guy kind of thing. So I got in, I was with 3 people from Sarajevo. All 3, it didn't take 2 minutes, and they start telling about the war. And this happened everywhere I went. Whenever I ate at a restaurant, started talking to the guy, they start talking about the war. It's something that maybe it's a form of therapy, I don't know, but they have to talk about the war and what they were doing. They talk about what they were doing during the war. And they talk about the Olympics. That was the other thing. But it was really funny too. My cab driver at one point, he said, "Oh yes, he was talking," and they talked about Tito. And Tito lives large, has a good figure. Now, that's not my memory of Tito. When he was a communist dictator. When I was growing up. But now I think they look back on it with some kind of nostalgia for that era. Yugoslavia was one whole, and everything seemed to be fine, even though it wasn't fine. They don't remember that part of it. There's also, but it was interesting because my cab driver said yes, because that was back when things were good, kind of thing was under Tito and in the 1980s. He said now he goes, we have democracy, unfortunately, and he said that with very deliberately, unfortunately. So different view than we would otherwise take, I think. Yeah.
Would you say you still got those sentiments of nationalism, passionate nationalism still, like some of these, people focus on their differences, call it racism. Did you see that? Was that common?
The people that I talked to were more nationalistic and diminishing, like Amina was, diminishing the differences. So nationalistic, yes, but not belligerently nationalistic. Where most countries aren't. I always kind of say nationalism. I'm not sure, but Americans kind of take the cake when it comes to nationalism, that way. But they certainly took a great pride in Bosnia itself, and again, typically downplayed that. But oddly, talking about the war, so it seems like the war would naturally bring about, maybe they talk about it more as their sort of own resilience, own personal resilience, I think. But like I said, Amina, the several conversations I had with her during the day was just fascinating because here she is, a Muslim from Sarajevo that grew up in these, being shot at by Serbian, Bosnian Serbs. And yet she was defending the Bosnian Serbs out in Srebrenica. That just really blew my mind. Maybe that's just her, but I sensed something that would probably be, worth talking to other Bosnians about it.
Yeah, it's just something about, I lived in England for 11 years, and always on television, on World War II, documentaries, films, commentaries.
But it was something about the camaraderie that seems to almost override the other parts of that. So I don't know if that's just an English thing or not. Maybe it is. Who knows?
I don't know, baby. You could be standing waiting for a bus, and you get an older person there, and they want to talk about the war. And they want to talk about, in 1982, over there on such and such a street, they found an unexploded warhead from World War II. Can you believe that? And when I was in World War II, and this is what happened, and I had to go live here. It's all still, at least then, seemed so raw.
The scholarship, or at least the books, maybe not scholarship, but certainly the books that have come out, it's really, though, always celebratory of the British, especially during the Blitz. Who's the one who did The Devil in the White City? Eric Larson. He wrote a book called The Splendid and the Vile, and it was about Winston Churchill's first year. I read it a couple years ago during the early stages of COVID. And Larson's a really good writer, but he comes to kind of a resounding end of that book saying that Winston Churchill single-handedly changed the morale of the British people, but the British people he's also kind of a product of that. And it's a really, this is what the English people put up with, this is what they did, and they overcame in spectacular fashion. So maybe that's just woven into their cultural memory of the war. It's kind of is a little bit for the United States in the sense that, we used to always joke that History Channel used to call it the World War II channel. Because that's mostly what they were always showing, back at that time. And there's still a military channel that shows a lot of that. And, they asked Trump that time about making America great again. And he said, they asked him, well, when do you game? And Trump, not surprisingly, gave a rather, vague answer. We know he's not a big history guy, right? But he said something about World War II, and he said something about Theodore Roosevelt, that era. And that's kind of for him, making America great was going back to those times. But I think that's a natural response. Many Americans do. They love to talk World War II. It probably World War II for the Americans is probably similar to what you see over there in England. But on the other hand, Vietnam probably puts a big damper on that later on. The Vietnam War really changes the way the American military is viewed, and a huge loss of faith in the American military as a force for good. Not that, again, the people that thought that haven't studied enough history to know other things about the American military, like in the Philippines, for example, or Native Americans in the West, for example. But there is that they wallow in the memories of World War II, where America always looks like the good guys wherever they go. And I said that's not entirely false. I said if you're a villager in northern Italy, and you could be liberated by some British troops or some Germans could be around, or Italians or Italian partisans or the Americans, you'd probably most want the Americans to show up because they probably have the least reason to have a gripe against you, and they bring stuff. They bring chocolate and cigarettes and all these kinds of things with them, which is really true. So there's that. I do think that not everything is quite equal in World War II, but on the other hand, boy, if you're anything out in the Pacific and the Americans show up and they think you're Japanese, atrocities, like crazy.
I think as Americans, we probably suffered the least out of World War II in that sense, right? We held out for such a long time and got into the war so late, and in a sense, it was profitable, and also the outcome of World War II left America as Team America, World Police, and the world order that was established all post World War II. And I think that probably has changed how people
still processing
how people remember
the magnitude
it, right?
of that event.
Plus, we're removed by a whole continent from what happened in Europe and what happened in the Pacific, and the Battle of Britain is definitely probably remembered in a mostly positive light because it was probably about British resiliency, and people were steadfast and successful, and I think that's remembered as a victory, right?
Oh yeah. I'm teaching my U.S. Navy World Wars for my graduate students, and I have my students reading a book this semester called, I can't remember the author's name, she's a professor at West Point, and it's a book called Looking for the Good War, and it's really about how Americans have worked hard to make this very shiny memory about World War II by looking at some of the divisions that took place during the war. One of the common sort of narratives, I guess, of World War II is common sacrifice, right? Everybody was willing to put up with rationing, and they were all willing to not travel and work really hard and long hours, and women were dancing with soldiers down at the USO, that kind of a narrative. When in fact, actually, Americans hated rationing. They tried to cheat on all they could. So it's not, you don't want to go totally the other way, but you have to kind of, it takes the shine off a little bit of that narrative. And she does that in that book, and I used it partly because she is a West Point professor. It's not like she's some, Berkeley historian or something like that. She is at West Point teaching this stuff, and it's kind of a caustic view, but it's an important one because she, looks at how Americans really had, they downplay American atrocities, especially rapes in a lot of places. That was very common where American soldiers went. You don't hear about that. You don't see that on the History Channel. on that, so. Oh, yes.
Yeah. So you were there kind of still in the shadows of Madeleine Albright's death.
Yeah.
And so did you get a sense of the narrative or memories changing on Secretary Albright, or was it still pretty straightforward?
I didn't ask a lot of questions about it, but I did have a few little conversations here and there. But again, generally speaking, I just felt, and I did ask a couple of the bottoms, a couple Sarajevians about it, and they typically saw her as the ender of the war. They saw her as the facilitator, and Bill Clinton kind of behind her a little bit on that. But what I was really struck by was I went to several bookstores, and their books are always there. Those books by Bill Clinton and books by Madeleine Albright, their books are prominently in the bookstores. So I didn't really sense, what there was before that had changed at all about her death. So I didn't really get a good sense. Just that it was generally a positive view. But like I said, this last book I just read by this Tim Marshall, the journalist, he was much more caustic about Madeleine Albright. The Madeleine Albright, was sort of telling about these safe areas and acting like everything was fine. Well, Srebrenica was a safe area. So it was really kind of willful. He was critical of the authorities, the NATO authorities, and the UN authorities, and the United States and Britain for really kind of not doing war down there until a later stage. One of the things they refused to do was commit any kind of ground troops. They thought that what they could do is use air power to do that. It turns out air power in Bosnia didn't do much. Because the Serbians were still doing whatever they wanted to on a lot of areas there in the 1990s. And it wasn't until they actually put troops in at the later part of the 1990s that things got to be more stable. So, cool. Well, thank you, guys. We could do this at my house. Just had friends over. That'd been better. So
Thank you.
it's all right. No, thanks, Mark. Appreciate you coming. Thank you, guys, and I'll see you at the office tomorrow.